Episode 10. Trouble. Sataran looked at Draka for a moment and then looked away. He knew that Draka was very powerful and that he was very skilled in battle and not one to be messed with. Sataran was more than impressed that Draka had been in Lucifer's mighty army, but he feared him greatly for that as well. Draka enjoyed the look of fear that came upon Sataran's face. Inwardly, his anger grew towards him over Lucifer's admission that he was thinking of having Sataran take his position in his mighty army. Draka quickly thought of several plans to do away with Sataran during their mission. Even though Sataran wasn't half as skilled or strong as he was, he still felt threatened by him. And for those very reasons that Sataran was nowhere close to him, it made the thought of being replaced by him even more appalling. Why one so weak? Draka thought to himself. That is a great insult. But it was more than Sataran's lack of skill and might that troubled Draka. He seemed to be more like one of God's mighty angels than he should be. I don't think that he fell far enough, Draka thought to himself. He suddenly got a sinister smile on his face. I will take him down lower before I drive him to the pit. Draka looked at Sataran. Let's go, he shouted as though Sataran were across the valley and not right next to him. Sataran jolted. He had been deep in thought about all of the things that he could learn from Draka while they were on their mission. Yes, my lord, Sataran said with a bow. Suddenly, Draka's heart was softened. And all it took was the words that Sataran spoke softly, and a bow. Draka watched Sataran closely as they took flight. Was Sataran a plant from God's mighty army? Would God do something like that? Sataran had a hard time keeping up with Draka due to Draka's immense size. Draka noticed it immediately and sped up a little to wear Sataran out. After several minutes, though, Sataran was so far behind Draka that Draka was forced to stop and wait for him. My apologies, my lord. It is my wingspan. It isn't nearly large enough to keep up with you. Sataran smiled as he caught his breath. I've never seen one so great as you, my lord. I am greatly pleased and honored to be at your side. Draka almost dropped out of the sky with Sataran's compliment. He wasn't one to normally be flattered, yet since he was cast out of Lucifer's mighty army, he was in much need of comfort and confirmation. He looked at Sataran and simply said, "Thank you." Sataran bowed his head quickly and followed Draka as closely by his side as he could. Draka felt a sudden power and a sudden urge to quickly fly ahead and back. It was painful for him to fly so slow, as though he were on a Sunday stroll. After an hour, he grew tired of flying so slowly. His wings, which were normally quite strong, were beginning to tire. He looked at Sataran, who was not looking very well. Are you ill? Draka asked. Sataran looked up at Draka. His eyes were dark, and his complexion was sallow. He was short of breath. I'm sorry, my lord. I don't understand what is happening. Something is wrong. Sataran looked at Draka with fear in his eyes. He put his hand to his chest. He was breathing, short, shallow breaths. He looked clammy. Suddenly, Sataran fell from the sky. Episode 11. The Sickness. Draka acted quickly and flew straight down and caught Sataran in plenty of time before he hit the earth. Sataran was limp and barely conscious. He looked up at Draka with deep, dark eyes. My lord, I thought that angels could not die, but I am certain that I am dying, Sataran said weakly. Draka looked down upon Sataran with compassion. Hang in there, Sataran, I have an idea, Draka said as he looked at him. Sataran barely nodded his head before he closed his eyes. Draka quickly flew straight up and above the clouds, looking up at heaven as he flew. Draka flew as quickly as he could towards the Vatican. He was confused and concerned that his wings were aching and that he was starting to sweat. God made us a little too close to human, I'm afraid, Draka said as he looked down at Sataran. Sataran's lips were dry and his mouth was slightly open. Draka listened as he continued to fly. He breathed still, Draka thought out loud. Sataran heard Draka and opened his eyes. He looked up at Draka just as Draka looked down at him. Their eyes locked. Draka had a flashback to the time before the fall. There was a great camaraderie between all of the angels. Draka agonized that there was no forgiveness for the third of the angels, including himself, that went with Lucifer after he tried to place himself above God and was cast out of heaven. God had set a barrier against it in his great and justified anger. As Draka reached Italy, the clouds thickened and were heavy with moisture. It felt good to both Draka, who was feeling tired and thirsty, and to Sataran, who was in a deep state of sleep. Once Draka neared Rome, he flew straight to Vatican City, then to Basilica's dome, and to St. Peter's altar. Draka quickly laid Sataran down near the altar and kneeled next to him. Sataran appeared to be lifeless. Draka rested his hand on Sataran's forehead and then looked up. "Please," was all that Draka could say. He couldn't believe that he cared about Sataran after he had plotted to destroy him and to throw him into the pit. Draka hung his head and closed his eyes. He knew that he had the sickness, too. He took several slow, shallow breaths. "How much time do I have?" Draka asked himself. He looked up again, as though he were looking through even the dome and into heaven. "Please," he said again. "It's not our time yet." Suddenly, one of God's angels allowed Draka to see him. He was standing to Draka's right. Draka wondered if the angel had been there all along, and knew that most likely he had been. "It is a spirit of infirmity," the 7-foot-tall angel said as he looked at Sataran and then Draka. "How is it so?" Draka asked as he adjusted himself to sit instead of kneeling. He thought back to the wine that had spilled as he drank from Lucifer's cup. It really was a bad omen, he thought to himself. "This I do not know," the angel named Lucan said. "Perhaps it is of Lucifer's doing." Draka looked at Lucan and then down at Sataran. He shook his head. "That I do not believe." Draka suddenly found it difficult to breathe. He looked up at the angel. "Can you help us?" he asked. Before he could hear the angel's response, Draka fainted. He lay over Sataran. His breathing was labored, though his body was still. The mighty angel went a step closer to Draka and Sataran and said, "Spirits of infirmity, leave and take your sickness and infirmities with you to the pit." Episode 12. On the Run. Almost instantly, Draka's breathing returned to normal, and he awoke. Draka started to feel well in moments. Sataran opened his eyes and looked at Draka. "What happened?" he asked. Draka looked at Sataran and then over at the angel who had cast the spirits of infirmity off of them. "The angel of the Lord's made us well," Draka said as he looked back at Sataran. Sataran sat up and looked at the angel, but remained silent.